Her tiny hands trembled as she grabbed the stranger's sleeve. Tears poured down her face. Her voice cracked with every word. "They hurt my mama. She's dying." The entire room went silent. Wine glasses stopped midair. Every single person turned to look. But the man she had chosen was the most feared crime lord in all of Europe. What he did next, nobody in that restaurant would ever forget it. Stay until the very end, because this story will absolutely shock you. But before we begin, if you believe in second chances and the power of kindness, hit that like button right now. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Now let's get into it. It was a bitter cold evening in Brussels, 1989. Snow fell gently outside the frosted windows of Le Palais d'Or, the Golden Palace, one of the most exclusive restaurants in all of Belgium. But this wasn't just any restaurant. This was Nikolai Volkov's kingdom. Every waiter knew to keep their eyes down and their mouths shut. Every guest understood the unspoken rules. You minded your business. You showed respect. And you never, ever caused a scene. Nikolai Volkov sat at his corner table like a king on a throne. At 55 years old, he was a mountain of a man. His presence alone commanded fear and respect in equal measure. His steel-gray eyes missed nothing. His word was absolute law. For 3 decades, he had built an empire that stretched across 5 countries. And tonight, like every Thursday for the past 15 years, he was meeting with his most trusted men. The conversation flowed in hushed tones. Money was counted. Territories were discussed. Problems were solved with cold precision. This was how Nikolai operated. Calculated. Methodical. Without a shred of emotion. He had survived longer than most in this brutal world because he understood one simple truth. Sentiment is weakness. And weakness gets you killed. But then something happened that would shatter everything Nikolai had built around his frozen heart. Boom. The restaurant's heavy wooden doors exploded open with such force they slammed against the walls. Every head whipped around. Conversations died instantly. The maitre d' rushed forward, panic written all over his face. But before he could say a word, everyone saw what, or rather, who had caused the disruption. A little girl, no more than 7 years old. She stood trembling in the doorway, her small body shaking violently. Her clothes were torn and filthy. Blood stained her white coat. Her dark blonde hair hung in tangled knots around a face streaked with tears and dirt. She looked like she had run through hell itself to get there. The child's eyes swept desperately across the room, searching, pleading, for anyone who could help her. The restaurant's guests stared back in stunned silence. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others whispered to each other, annoyed that their expensive evening had been interrupted by what they assumed was just some street child. But this little girl wasn't looking for money. She was looking for salvation. Her gaze landed on Nikolai's table. And something in those innocent brown eyes recognized power when she saw it. Maybe it was the way grown men deferred to him. Maybe it was the expensive suit or the way he sat like he owned the world. Or maybe it was something deeper. A child's instinct recognizing the one person in that entire room who could actually do something. Without hesitation, she ran straight toward him. The room held its breath. Nikolai's bodyguards tensed immediately, hands moving toward their concealed weapons. This was unprecedented. No one approached Nikolai Volkov uninvited. Especially not like this. But before anyone could react, the little girl reached his table and grabbed his sleeve with both tiny hands. Her fingers clutched the expensive fabric like it was a lifeline. And then she spoke words that would echo in Nikolai's mind for the rest of his life. "They hurt my mama. She's dying." The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a snowflake land in that restaurant. Every eye turned to Nikolai, waiting to see how the most ruthless crime lord in Europe would handle this impossible moment. His reputation was built on being untouchable, unfeeling, a man who showed mercy to no one. Nikolai looked down at the child clinging to his arm. Her face was turned up toward his, those brown eyes wide with desperation, and something he hadn't seen directed at him in decades. Hope. And in that moment, something shifted deep inside the hardened criminal's chest. Something he hadn't felt in 30 long years. You see, Nikolai Volkov hadn't always been the cold, ruthless crime lord that all of Europe feared. Once upon a time, he had been a different man. A man who understood what it meant to love, and to lose everything. 30 years earlier, Nikolai had been married to a woman named Catherine. She was the light of his entire world. The only person who could make him laugh. the only one who could soften the sharp edges that life had carved into his soul. They had dreams of starting a family, of building something beautiful together, despite the dark world Nikolai operated in. But those dreams were destroyed in a single night. A rival organization decided to send Nikolai a message. They didn't come for him directly. That would have been too easy, too expected. Instead, they went after the one thing they knew would destroy him more completely than any bullet ever could. They went after Catherine. Nikolai came home that night to find his world shattered. His wife, his future, his heart, all of it gone. The police asked questions they knew they'd never get answers to. And Nikolai learned the hardest lesson of his life. In his world, love was a weakness that could be exploited by anyone ruthless enough to target it. From that night forward, Nikolai Volkov built walls around his heart that no one could penetrate. He became ruthless because ruthlessness meant survival. He became feared because fear commanded respect. And he became alone, because alone meant no one else could ever be used against him again. For 30 years, those walls had held firm. Until tonight. Now, looking down at this little girl who reminded him so painfully of the children he and Catherine had dreamed of having, those walls began to crack. The child's grip tightened on his sleeve. Her voice came out in broken sobs as she tried to explain what had happened. Through her tears, Nikolai began to piece together a story that made his blood run cold. The little girl's name was Amélie. Her mother, Isabelle Laurent, owned a small bookshop on the south side of Brussels. They lived in a tiny apartment above the shop. Just the two of them, trying to make an honest living in a neighborhood where honest lives were hard to protect. But their neighborhood had become disputed territory between two rival gangs. Both demanded protection money. Isabelle had been caught in the middle, unable to pay both sides, unwilling to choose between them. And tonight, that impossible situation had exploded into violence. Amélie's words tumbled out in a desperate rush. She described how the men came after closing time. How they demanded money her mother didn't have. And then Amélie described something that made even Nikolai's hardened associates shift uncomfortably in their seats. The men had beaten her mother unconscious and left her bleeding on the floor of the bookshop. Amélie had hidden behind the counter, watching in terror as they destroyed everything her mother had worked so hard to build. When they finally left, laughing about teaching the neighborhood a lesson, Amélie crawled out to find her mother barely breathing. "I tried to wake her up," Amélie whispered, her small voice breaking. "But she won't open her eyes. There's so much blood." The restaurant remained frozen. Nikolai's men exchanged uncertain glances. Some of the other guests had begun whispering, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding. But Nikolai wasn't thinking about his reputation. He wasn't calculating business implications. For the first time in 30 years, Nikolai was thinking with his heart instead of his head. He looked down at Amélie, this brave little girl who had somehow found the courage to burst into the most dangerous restaurant in Brussels and approach the most feared man in the room. She could have gone to the police, could have called an ambulance, could have run to neighbors. Instead, she had chosen him. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Nikolai asked, his voice gentler than anyone in that room had ever heard it. Amélie," she managed between sobs. "Amélie Laurent." Nikolai nodded slowly. Then he looked up at his bodyguard, Victor. "Get the car," he said quietly. "Now." Victor hesitated for just a moment. In all his years working for Nikolai, he had never seen his boss make a decision this impulsive, this emotional. "Boss, maybe we should." "I said get the car." The steel in Nikolai's tone reminded everyone that despite the unusual circumstances, he was still very much in charge. As Victor hurried toward the exit, Nikolai knelt down beside Amélie, so they were at eye level. His massive frame dwarfed the tiny girl, but somehow his presence seemed to comfort rather than frighten her. "Amélie, listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice steady and calm. "I'm going to help your mama. But first, I need you to tell me exactly what these men looked like. Can you do that?" Amélie nodded eagerly, relief flooding her tear-stained face. Through her sobs, she began to describe the attackers. Two men, both young, both wearing dark jackets with red patches. One had a jagged scar across his right eyebrow. The other had a tattoo of a wolf on his hand. They had called each other by names, Luca and Anton. Nikolai's expression darkened as he listened. He recognized the descriptions immediately. Luca Barbieri and Anton Kessler. Mid-level enforcers for a gang run by someone Nikolai had once considered an ally. Someone named Jean-Luc Moreau. This was the plot twist that changed everything. Jean-Luc had once worked with Nikolai. They had an understanding, a truce. Certain neighborhoods were supposed to remain neutral, off limits to this kind of brutality. But now Jean-Luc had broken that unspoken code. And he had done it in the worst way possible. Nikolai stood up, his decision made. "Victor," he called. "Contact Dr. Rousseau. Tell him to meet us at St. Michel Hospital with everything he needs for emergency surgery. Tell him it's a priority case." Then he looked at another of his men. "Pierre, I want you to find Luca Barbieri and Anton Kessler. Bring them to the warehouse on Rue de Flandre. Alive. I want to have a conversation with them." Pierre nodded with a grim smile. "Consider it done, boss." Nikolai looked around the restaurant one final time. He knew this moment would be talked about for years. The night Nikolai Volkov showed mercy. But he didn't care anymore. All he cared about was the small hand that slipped into his as Amelie looked up at him with complete trust. "Is my mama going to be okay?" she asked in a tiny voice. Nikolai squeezed her hand gently. "I'm going to make sure she is," he promised. And Nikolai Volkov never made promises he couldn't keep. The ride to the bookshop took 15 minutes through the snow-covered streets of Brussels. Nikolai sat in the back of his black Mercedes with Amelie beside him, her small body finally beginning to relax for the first time in hours. She had stopped crying, though her eyes remained wide and watchful. Every few seconds, she would look up at Nikolai, as if making sure he was still there, still committed to helping her. Victor drove with the precision of a man who had navigated dangerous situations many times before. Behind them, 2 more cars followed, one carrying Dr. Rousseau and his medical equipment, the other filled with Nikolai's most trusted men. When they pulled up to the bookshop, Nikolai could see the devastation immediately. The front window had been smashed. Books lay scattered across the snowy sidewalk, their pages fluttering in the cold wind. The sign that had once proudly displayed Lawrence Books hung crooked and damaged. But Nikolai's attention was focused on what lay inside. Through the shattered storefront, they could see a figure lying motionless on the floor among scattered books and overturned shelves. Isabelle Laurent lay crumpled behind the counter. Her dark hair fanned across the wooden floor. Blood pooled beneath her head, and her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. Nikolai had seen enough violence in his lifetime to know she was fading fast. Dr. Rousseau rushed past them, his medical bag already open. He knelt beside Isabelle, his practiced hands moving quickly. "Severe head trauma," he muttered, checking her pulse. "Possible internal bleeding. We need to move her now." As the paramedics loaded Isabelle onto a stretcher, Nikolai's phone buzzed. Pierre's voice came through, crisp and efficient. "Boss, we found them. Luca and Anton were at a bar on Rue Haute, bragging about their work tonight. They're secured at the warehouse." Nikolai's jaw tightened. The rage that had been simmering beneath his protective instincts began to surface. "Good," he replied, his voice deadly calm. "I'll be there after I get Amelie settled." At the hospital, Dr. Rousseau disappeared into surgery while Nikolai made arrangements. Amelie would stay in a private room with round-the-clock security. The best pediatric care available. Money was no object when it came to keeping this child safe. But as Nikolai tucked Amelie into the hospital bed, he knew his night was far from over. The little girl had fallen asleep clutching a small stuffed rabbit one of the nurses had brought her. Exhaustion finally claiming her small body. She looked so peaceful, so innocent, so different from the broken, terrified child who had stumbled into his restaurant hours earlier. Nikolai stepped into the hallway and pulled out his phone. "Victor, bring the car around. It's time to visit our guests." The warehouse on Rue de Flandre was one of Nikolai's more discreet properties. No neighbors to hear sounds. No windows for light to escape. Just thick concrete walls and the kind of privacy that allowed for serious conversations. Luca Barbieri and Anton Kessler sat tied to chairs in the center of the empty space. Their earlier bravado had been replaced by the kind of fear that came with recognizing your situation had gone from bad to catastrophic. Nikolai entered slowly, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice conversational. "I understand you had a busy evening." Luca, the one with the scar, tried to maintain his defiance. "Look, whatever this is about, we can work something out. You know how business works." Nikolai walked a slow circle around them, studying them like specimens under a microscope. "Business," he repeated. "Tell me, Luca, what business do you think beating unconscious mothers in front of their children falls under?" The color drained from Luca's face. Anton began to sweat visibly. They were starting to understand that this wasn't about territory or money or any of the usual reasons. The woman was holding out on us, Anton stammered. She owed protection money. We had to make an example. An example? Vincent's voice cut like a blade. What example did you think you were making when you traumatized a 7-year-old girl? Neither man answered. Nikolai reached into his jacket and pulled out a drawing. It was a picture Amelie had sketched while waiting at the hospital. A crayon drawing of her mother surrounded by books and flowers. This is Amelie Laurent, Nikolai said, holding up the drawing. 7 years old. Loves reading fairy tales and hot chocolate. Dreams of becoming a teacher someday. Tonight, she watched 2 grown men beat her mother unconscious over 85 euros. He set the drawing on a nearby table where both men could see it. 85 euros, he repeated. That's what Isabelle Laurent had in her register. Barely enough to cover tomorrow's groceries. And you two thought it was worth putting a child through hell to take it. Luka made one last desperate attempt. Look, Mr. Volkov, we didn't know the kid was there. If we had known. If you had known what? Nikolai's voice was ice. You would have beaten her too? Made sure there were no witnesses. He walked closer until he stood directly over them. Here's what's going to happen, he said quietly. You're going to tell me exactly how much money your organization has made from terrorizing shop owners in Isabelle's neighborhood. Every euro. Every cent. We don't have that authority, Anton whispered. The money goes up the chain. We just collect. Nikolai nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected. Then it sounds like I need to have a conversation with your boss as well. What's his name? Jean-Luc Moreau, Luka whispered. But you can't touch him. You two have an agreement. Had an agreement, Nikolai corrected. Past tense. He pulled out his phone. Victor, arrange a meeting with Jean-Luc Moreau. Tonight. Let him know that Nikolai Volkov would like to discuss how his organization treats innocent people. The meeting happened 2 hours later at an abandoned factory. Jean-Luc Moreau arrived with 6 men, trying to look confident, but unable to hide the nervousness in his eyes. He was younger than Nikolai, maybe 40, with expensive clothes and too much cologne. The kind of man who thought money and violence made him powerful. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Nikolai, Jean-Luc said, forcing a smile. This is unexpected. I thought we had an understanding about. We had an understanding, Nikolai interrupted. That understanding included keeping certain neighborhoods neutral. It included not terrorizing innocent people. And it definitely included not traumatizing children. Jean-Luc's smile faltered. Look, business is business. Sometimes people need reminders. Your boys, Nikolai's voice was like thunder, put a 7-year-old girl through hell tonight. They beat her mother unconscious over 85 euros. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The woman was 3 months behind on payments, Jean-Luc said defensively. We gave her warnings. Nikolai took a step closer, and despite being surrounded by his own men, Jean-Luc instinctively backed away. Do you know what Isabelle Laurent does for a living? Nikolai asked quietly. She runs a bookshop that barely makes enough to survive. She works 16-hour days selling stories to children, university textbooks to students, novels to people who still believe in beauty. He pulled out Amelie's drawing again. She's been behind on your blood money because she spent her savings on medicine when Amelie had pneumonia last winter. She chose her daughter's life over your protection racket. Nikolai's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. And somehow you thought that made her fair game. Jean-Luc tried to speak, but Nikolai wasn't finished. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to liquidate your entire operation in Isabelle's neighborhood. Every protection payment, every debt, every outstanding balance, it all disappears. Tonight. That's impossible. You're going to take whatever money you've collected from that neighborhood over the past year, and you're going to distribute it back to every shop owner, every family, every person you've been bleeding dry. We don't have that kind of cash. Then find it, Nikolai said. Sell your cars, your jewelry, your mother's silverware if you have to. But those people are getting their money back. He stepped even closer. And if I ever hear about any of your people operating within 10 blocks of Isabelle's bookshop again, if so much as one of your boys jaywalks in her neighborhood, I will personally introduce you to consequences your father should have taught you about years ago. The threat hung in the cold air. Jean-Luc understood. His operation in that neighborhood was finished. 6 months later, Isabelle Laurent stood behind the counter of her rebuilt bookshop, watching through sparkling new windows as her daughter Amelie played in the small reading garden that had mysteriously appeared behind their building. The gangs had vanished from the neighborhood entirely. The streets felt safe again. And every Thursday evening, like clockwork, a black Mercedes would pull up outside. Nikolai Volkov would step out, not as the feared crime lord of Brussels, but as the man who had chosen to let a little girl's courage crack open his frozen heart. Isabel would prepare fresh coffee. Amelie would show him her latest drawings and tell him about the books she was reading. And for a few precious hours, the three of them would sit together like the family none of them had dared to dream was possible. The city still whispered about the night Nikolai Volkov saved a child and found his soul. But Amelie knew the real truth that the adults had missed. She hadn't saved her mother by finding the most dangerous man in Brussels. She had saved him by showing him that even the hardest heart could choose love over fear. That kindness, in the end, was the greatest power of all. Because sometimes the smallest hands carry the greatest power to change everything. Thanks for watching this incredible true story. If this touched your heart, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories that prove humanity still exists in the darkest places. Drop a comment below telling me, what act of kindness changed your life? I'll see you in the next one. Stay kind, stay strong, and never underestimate the power of compassion.